And my sense is that about a third to 40% of people who think they know their Enneagram type don't quite have it right.
Hi there. Welcome to the Connecting KC podcast. I'm Rachel.Kilmer, also known as Rach the Realtor on the internet, where I love, connecting all things KC. I'm a metro area real estate agent, retired sports reporter, and mom, and probably too old to call myself a TikToker, but honestly, that's how we got here. You can learn more at www.rachtherealtorkc.com. But this show is all about introducing you to all of the movers and shakers, interesting people, heartfelt stories, and funny quirks that make this vibrant community home. So let's get right to it with today's episode of Connecting KC. Welcome to today's episode of Connecting Kansas City. It is a topic that I am utterly fascinated with, so I am so excited to dive in and welcome Jim Gum to the show. Jim is an Enneagram teacher, trainer, and coach based in the Metro. The Enneagram is a system of personality that describes 9 distinct ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. Since his introduction to the Enneagram in 1991, he has been passionately committed to sharing it as a tool to assist groups, couples, and individuals to write a whole new story, one of greater awareness and compassion. Jim offers team building workshops and ongoing training for workplaces, as well as executive and personal coaching packages for individuals and couples. He launched the Story Enneagram podcast in 2022, and you can learn about his work at www.storyenneagram.com. Jim, thank you for being here today.
Absolutely. It's good to be with you.
So for the people listening that don't know what the heck the Enneagram is, you kind of touched on it in your bio, but high level, explain what is this foreign word?
Yeah, so most people are familiar with personality assessments, and probably the most common ones that people get exposed to would be the Myers-Briggs type indicator or the DISC indicator. And all they are is they describe patterns of behavior. That's, predictable patterns of behavior. And the idea is very simple, that we tend to live a patterned life, and we tend to do things and react and think in certain pattern ways. Well, the Enneagram is 9 distinct patterns. The Ennea means 9. 9 distinct patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. And some very, very smart people have kind of collected these thoughts.
Yeah. And how does one become an Enneagram professional? So you're introduced to it in 1991. What was your journey to getting where you are today?
So I would have been a armchair Enneagram enthusiast, but I started my formal education about 10 years ago and proceeded to get a certification in teaching from the Narrative Enneagram, which is the oldest Enneagram school that's based in the Bay Area. And then a few years later, working with some of those mentors, I got an additional certification with the Chestnut Pais Enneagram Academy. Beatrice Chestnut, who's the author of The Complete Enneagram, was my mentor in the narrative tradition. So I just kind of kept following her, her school, her teaching.
Sure.
Yeah. So that's how I did it, and the education was really good. I knew a lot, but disciplining yourself to really, especially learn the types that you don't know as well. I think that it rounded out my understanding of the Enneagram.
For sure. So on my real estate team, we have a lot of different age ranges. And so me and my peer, that's the closest in age to me, talk in shorthand with Enneagram, like, oh, well, I acted that way in this interaction because I'm a 3, or like, I know that bothered you more than me because you're an 8. Like, it is just part of our conversation every day. But our older teammates looked at us like we were absolutely crazy when we first started talking about the Enneagram like that. Like, it's like, I'm a 3 the way that my middle name is Lee, like it's just such a fact for me. But then one of them attended one of your classes at a church here in Kansas City. And she was like, I get it now. She was like, I understand what you're saying. And I'm totally know my type now. How have you experienced people going from this is really weird, why is it so culty around the Enneagram, to like, wow, this is actually a really helpful tool to use in my day-to-day life?
Yeah. Well, this is, in 32 years, I've seen a massive change, So for about 20 years, I told people about the Enneagram, and I was their entry point. And I learned it in a spiritual direction setting. So it was a tool for growth, and kind of went to workshops and stuff like that. After 2015, when the Enneagram became popular, people began to be a little bit more polarized about it. And I never assume that someone likes the Enneagram. I don't assume that somebody, because I made that mistake a few times, and I'd be talking about the Enneagram or something, and a friend would say, "I hate the Enneagram." So here's what I think is happening right now. Um, the Enneagram has tipped over in the popular culture after the release of the book, The Road Back to You. Um, and that was the first book that was published by InterVarsity Press, and kind of opened up a whole segment of population that was interested in it. The mistakes I hear people making, though, with that is, how do you know about the Enneagram? They go, "Well, I've taken the test." That's probably the most common thing. And there is no the test. Myers-Briggs is a test, and but at the Enneagram, there's no definitive test. Number one. Number two, it's a little bit more nuanced than most people see. And I meet a lot of people who somebody goes, "Oh my gosh, you're just totally this type. You're totally a 7. I see it all." And somebody gets that label, and then they wear it for a long time. And my sense is that about a third to 40% of people who think they know their Enneagram type don't quite have it right. Yeah. So there's a lot of opportunity for me, but I think it's my specialty is I deal with subtype information, which is really nuanced. Number one. Number two, there's a whole bunch of lookalike types. And because of that, and without most people don't know a way to parse those out, I feel like people probably aren't getting the most out. There's other people that are just harder to type, or they don't manifest, or they might be just really healthy people, and it just doesn't resonate as much. So yeah. So that I what I try to do is I try to make sure we get you to the right place, and then it's your decision. You get to decide your type. I don't get to decide it. So that's kind of what I.
I know it's a big no-no to, like, not point at someone and be like, "Oh, you're a whatever," but it's so hard
Yeah,
not to.
it's annoying, especially if that person doesn't know anything about the Enneagram. And I worked with a gentleman for years, and he was at a church event, and there was a concert, and somebody from the band was really into the Enneagram, and they told him, "Oh, you're helping load up my van, therefore you must be a 2." And he held on to that for several years, and it's like, yeah, that means that everyone who ever helps somebody is a 2. Like, it just doesn't make any sense at all. So but we took a couple years of trying to make sense of what he was. And when he finally found it, it's like, oh my gosh, it all makes sense. And I love to see that for people. But what the Enneagram really is about motivation. Why do I do what I do? That's what makes it really different. Not, I think a lot of assessments they just name your habits and your behaviors, but the why is what makes the Enneagram so fascinating.
Absolutely. So I grew up in a church and a religious background, and I can't remember where I read this, but that a lot of Christian women think they're 2s at first, which I spent a couple of years thinking I was a 2, because I think it's like you're so cultured as a woman in America in general, especially a Christian woman, to serve others all the time, be serving others. And
There's several things that play into that. Number
yeah.
one, there's a teaching, it's better to give than to receive.
Hmm.
Number
Hmm.
two, the 2 is the female archetype.
Interesting.
Number three, the 8 is the male archetype.
Huh. I did not know that.
So if you are a male 2 or a female 8, you're kind of like an different than the other 2s and the other 8s.
Huh.
The other thing that I think happens is in women's lives, often there's seasonalities where they're into career and they're into caretaking. And anyone who has young children and they're the primary caretaker is going to feel like a 2.
Mm-hmm.
Or, that you're just serving and you're selflessly and sacrificially serving. Your toddler at 3 doesn't go, man, Mom, I really appreciate the way you made my lunch today, how nutritious it was. They just don't do that. It's a lot of giving without a lot of goodies in return.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. So, what is the religious type with this? Because it does. I first heard of it through the church, and I know that some of your speaking takes place at communities of faith. Where does it intersect with religion, and where does it separate from religion?
Um, I think it's a perfect framework that is spiritual and psychological. And if I know my environment where I'm teaching it, I'll lean which way it's appropriate. But this is what I think is really important to know is in the 3rd and 4th century, there was a group of people called the Desert Fathers and Mothers. And they retreated to the desert to devote themselves to God and his word. Okay. There was a gentleman there by the name of Evagrius Ponticus. And we know about him because he could write. And he looked at these different desert fathers and mothers, and he saw they had these thoughts that kind of got in the way of their devotion to God. He wrote a book that was entitled Talking Back, and it's based on the gospel account where Jesus is out in the desert, he's tempted, and the first temptation is he's hungry, and he says, hey, if you were the Son of God, you could turn these stones into bread. And then Jesus replies, man does not live by bread alone. And so that talking back was the idea of this book. And so these 8 thoughts that he had were like lust or gluttony or greed, and how you could use sections of scripture to talk back to those thoughts. That's in the 3rd or 4th century. Those 8 thoughts kind of moved from the Greek world into the Latin world. And then in the late 500s, the Pope kind of codified them and they became the 7 deadly sins. The Enneagram symbol has the 7 deadly sins placed around it, plus 2 more. And the 2 additional sins are vanity and fear. And so it has the spiritual root to it, and the idea of overcoming these things to go from a vice to a virtue, like from pride to humility, is just part of the nature of what's embedded in the Enneagram, is the spiritual sense. And secondly, learning your type, I say with my company, is just the beginning. Learning your type is really learning your defensive strategy or your adaptive behavior. It's actually very limiting, and you should not double down on it. You should begin to free yourself up from it and observe it, and don't use it all the time, basically, because that's what we tend to do. We tend to behave in very predictable patterns around our type.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you you and the Enneagram community as a whole think that someone's type can change? Like, are you born with your type, or does it change based on life circumstances?
Then you can't answer the nature nurture question fully. My belief is that your type is kind of baked in to who you are. And I have 4 children. I have 4 boys, and they have a affect at a very young age. They're kind of a type almost. And the nature nurture thing, same two parents, four different types of kids, and you think you're treating them the same. Does your Enneagram type change? I don't think it really does. What I do think is one of two things. It's sometimes hard to parse out what your type is, and you might live for a long time thinking you were one type and you're really another. That's very common. There's kind of like oh my gosh, this is how this plays out. And I see that happening a lot. And secondly, the ultimate goal of the Enneagram type is to dissociate or transcend it. And I always tell people, like, if you say you're a 3, did you identify as a 3?
Yeah, 3-wing 2. Yep.
Okay. So when you identify as a 3, what that means is you're probably better than anyone else at getting from point A to point B, at moving a project along, of seeing to completion. I mean, efficient. Somebody goes, I don't know how we're going to do this. You go, well, you do this, 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 this. It's just as baked into who you are. That is a wonderful talent and skill. And it's necessary about 1/9 of my interactions. Do I need that skill? About 1/9 of the time, do I need to really put that in? If I do that all the time with everything, it's really unpleasant for others. It's like, hey, couldn't we just have fun? Or, hey, couldn't we make sure everybody else is doing fine here? Or, hey, couldn't we slow it down and maybe make sure we're making the best idea here? You know what I mean? And so kind of the work of the Enneagram is I don't want to act out my type in its purest personality form, because that is so limiting. And so does my type change? I think eventually, like some of my teachers, I can't tell what type they are. They've kind of transcended it unless they tell me. And I actually had one person think that I was a completely different type. He goes, I don't really think you're your type. And it's like, no, I know I am. And he goes, no, you're just like this. And it's like, yeah, you don't know what's going on inside. I might not be manifesting that. So that's my personal belief, is that a lot of times people don't have their type right to start with. That's probably really common. And then secondly, the goal is not to play your type out, all the time.
Mm-hmm. How are you seeing the reception of this in Kansas City specifically? We are a very Midwest culture, and I feel like it takes us a few years to adapt to things that happen on the coast first. Are you received very well everywhere you go here? Is there a lot of demand for you speaking about this? What is that area like?
There's a lot more openness to the Enneagram, and in business and in churches, and it's growing. I know that in maybe 2017 or 18, Google searches for the Enneagram outpaced searches for the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So it's common that, right now when I talk to people about the Enneagram, the majority of people have heard about it. 10 years ago, it was the minority, for sure. So there's an openness to it. I do think what teaching of the Enneagram, or the quality of the presentation, shapes a little bit of their feeling or an openness about the Enneagram. And here's my thing. Like, I go into businesses and I do team building type stuff all the time. People often will ask me, so what's your type? They'll just ask me right off, I barely know them. They go, oh, you do the Enneagram, what's your type? They'll ask me that immediately. And I don't tell people right away, or I'll ask them if they're safe. And the reason is if I tell you my type, you will know all my strengths and all my weaknesses. And I find that people who don't handle the Enneagram carefully make fun of other types, and it's mean. It's actually mean-spirited. And a lot of people learn about the Enneagram through Instagram, and they're funny and stuff, but it's making fun of. And so if I go into a workplace thing, I have to create ground rules and just say, hey, we never make light of someone's weaknesses. That is uncool. And that is the reason why people don't like the Enneagram sometimes. Or they're, some types don't want to look at their weaknesses at all or don't think they have them. And some types spend way too much time thinking about their weaknesses. So for me, it's all about that, it's about self-awareness and compassion. Every type is carrying a burden that they don't even quite know what they're carrying. That is, what is this motivation that I got to get something done? What is underneath that? Well, it's a pretty fragile thing. And that's true for all 9 types.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I find it very helpful for like that exactly, digging down deep and being like, okay, well, I'm feeling this way in my gut, but why does my gut feel that way? And I find it helpful to use kind of almost in therapy. My therapist prefers Myers-Briggs, but do you see like the therapist community, how do they typically react to Enneagram? And like, is it kind of like half love it and half hate it, just like in the greater population, or what have you experienced with that?
Well, and I taught a continuing ed class this summer, and I'm planning to continue to do that for the therapeutic community. What I believe is that most of them are exposed to assessments, but have very little teaching and exposure to the Enneagram. However, in the last, I'd say since 2015, what a therapist finds is somebody comes in, they go, well, I'm a 3. And they might as well say, well, I'm from Mars. And, it just doesn't mean anything to them. And so my mentor, Beatrice Chestnut, was a therapist. She goes, it's such a great shortcut, and not to shortchange that client, but if I know your type, I know your growth path. I know what's underneath it. And that's where it's real. It's not just your behavior. It's like this motivational thing, and kind of what is the false belief and the controlling emotion, anger, fear, sadness that is running the show. And so I work with a lot of couples, and all of my work happened accidentally. I'd teach a class, and then somebody goes, will you meet with me, or would you meet with us, or would you come to my business? That's how all my work started. It's like, I guess, I don't know. And a couple will call me, or usually a woman will call me and say, hey, I'm thinking about, I would like to explore coaching the Enneagram. And they want to get their spouse involved. And I consider Enneagram coaching as a gateway drug to therapy for a guy. It's hey, I'm getting coached. I'm not in therapy. And if I'll ask somebody, I go, well, do you have any idea what your type and your partner's type might be? And they'll say, well, I think we're this and this. I go, so is this happening? And I'll describe a couple scenarios, and it's just like, how do you know what's happening? I go, it's just, we have patterns. And the sooner that we can, number one, recognize our own patterns, and then secondly, depersonalize them. Like, hey, he's not doing that to annoy you. He's doing it unconsciously, and you're doing your own thing unconsciously. And if you could just see it as that, it's something, it's not him or it's not her. It's this, the Enneagram is really about these internal drives and motivations that we don't fully own or consciously aware of, but they're strong. They're really strong.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Okay, 3 more trust. 3 more questions for you. Do the Myers-Briggs types correspond with the Enneagram?
Yeah. Every time I hear a system, you can obviously make some correlations. There have been people, and there are books where people have mapped out the 16 Myers-Briggs patterns and the 9 Enneagram types. Now, I'm in this group that specializes on subtypes, which gives 3 for each type. and it's pretty nuanced. And it gives you a lot of flexibility and describes a lot of the look-alike thing. Are you motivated by fear or control, or it's just, you might act the same way, but you're underneath it, you're driving for something different. So every system I ever hear, like I work with a therapist who uses internal family systems, and I hear about the model, and I'm always integrating that with Enneagram, because Enneagram is really just about thinking, feeling, and acting. It's all 3 based, or 3 times 3, or 3 times 3 times 3. It's always that. So I can usually correlate any things pretty well. It just makes sense. It's logical.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Okay, last 2 questions I ask everyone that comes on the show. First thing is, what is a great meal you've had in Kansas City recently?
I'll tell you what it is. I live near downtown Overland Park, and there's a Mediterranean restaurant that moved in right next door to Thompson Park called Hummus and Pita. And it is the best hummus and the best pita I've ever had. I mean, it's so savory, so fresh, and I just can't get enough of it. So that's my go-to. I had a friend who said, "Oh my gosh, I went to this restaurant right by your house." I go, "I know. I go there a lot. It's amazing." So,
Okay, I love me some hummus, so I will be making a trip just for that. I love it. Yes. Okay, last question is, where can people find you? If they're interested in learning more about the Enneagram, they're interested in having you out to their church or their business, how can they get a hold of you?
so my name's Jim Gum, Jimgum, and that's my Gmail address. I was the early, pioneer to get that address there. But my website, storyenneagram.com, and there's the inquiry form, and you can see everything that I do there. And that's really the best way to get in touch with me. And yeah, would love to hear from you. Always like to talk to people. People are fascinating. So everybody's got a story, and I just love working with people.
And thus the name of the business was born, Story Enneagram.
Right.
I love it. Well, Jim, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Truly, truly fascinating for me. I know for the listeners as well. So appreciate you being here. And guys, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.